Good day. Hi, everyone. How are you going? Well done on waking up for the second session. Who here attended the first session, out of curiosity? Well done. There's like 3 early birds in the room. Outstanding. Hi, I'm Shimron. I am from NSYST. I'm a practice manager at NSYST, but I'm also a virtual technology specialist at Microsoft for productivity. I have here Mr. Shashank with me. Introduce himself.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. Shashank Pawar, SQL Server technology specialist with Microsoft, looking after the SQL Server stack. Just a show of hands, who's here from the SQL Server side of DBAs in the room?
Good.
Oh, not many. Oh my God, I'm talking to the SharePoint guys.
SharePoint people?
You'll learn about SQL Server, don't worry.
I can already see where this is going. I'm liking this already. We have a few points here where we are going to talk about what's more important. I think we already know the answer to that. But today's session is actually about what a SharePoint consultant needs to know about SQL. And what we're going to do today is going to cover a bit of a scenario. It's a loose scenario. We're going to take a hypothetical case where people, you guys might be facing on a day-to-day basis. And we're going to take that scenario and try to give you a roadmap to what's the best approach to take in order to plan a successful deployment. So I'm going to start with our scenario. So where are you from? Which company? BA Systems, excellent. So BA Systems, how many people are you? How many staff? Okay, so we just...
Yeah, maybe, Shim, we should mention that we do want to make this session interactive, and we got a few good giveaways. Gears of War cap, yeah, Gears of War, Xbox guys, some nice Bing giveaways, Microsoft toolkits. So yeah, please be awake in the session.
You know, answer my questions. That's what Shashank is saying. So we're going to actually downsize your company. I apologize. Is there anyone here with less than 1,500 staff? Where do you work? Excellent, outstanding. So, all right, good. So we just increased the size of your company. You now have 3 global offices: Australia, New Zealand, Fiji. Works out? Perfect.
That's where you're going to be working, right?
I'm going to go for Fiji. Yes, as the branch deployment. You have 1,500 users. Congratulations. You just hired some people, acquired a few businesses, and it's all going well. You want a SharePoint site, or the company wants you to deploy a SharePoint site. 99.9% availability. And the purpose of the site is there'll be some subject matter experts. Does that apply to your company?
Yes.
Good. If you would have said no, I would have said yes anyway, so it doesn't really matter. But that's good. You have lots of subject matter experts, internal and external. So you want to share information outside of your, organization. It's important that people are able to search based on their permissions, content across the organization. Marketing department, I don't know how come. They want to publish some web pages. Fine, we'll let them do that as well, just to make our scenario a little bit more interesting. There will be a bit of rich media content. Those of you that come from SQL background already know where I'm heading with this. And there'll be some business intelligence and integration with line of business applications, just so Shashank is not bored during this session.
And it actually makes your SharePoint useful.
Makes sure, yeah, easy.
Remember that.
But, you know. So this scenario, high level, who here has faced something similar or been in a similar situation? We can change the slide deck. It's not a problem. Okay, excellent. How did that go? How did that deployment go for you? Good. Yeah, of course. Yeah, I want to say I'm surprised, but I'm going to have to go with this, right? So let's talk about our overall design goals, because the requirements are very clear. Minimum number of server farms, right? We don't want to have 5,000 of them. We want to have something that's practical. We do want to spread across intranet, extranet, and internet. So for us, it's important that we don't limit ourselves in that functionality. Needless to say, 1,500 staff, this is just day one. You're going to grow to 6,000. Like BA Systems, you say? BAC Systems? You're going to grow to 6,000 in no time. So we want to make sure that it's scalable and caters for that growth. And of course, without redesigning the whole system. Access to several groups of users. As we said, some users are actually internal, some are partners, maybe a bit of federation, some internet access customers, etc. And when we are actually designing the system, we'll try to make sure that we're not losing out on anything. So this type of scenario, what we're trying to do as a bit of the first giveaway, I think, is this slide. It's not the best one. We have some better stuff. But if you look at this, we're trying to capture the 8 key steps that one will have to follow, or would ideally follow, to properly put a design. Guys, if you want to have a seat, actually, there's a couple of loose chairs, and same rule applies if you're going to doze off at the back, like a goose in there, right? So those 8 steps here, we'll try to follow each and every one of them in detail. This is a level 200 session. We'll go as deep, technically as deep as you're interested. We'll try to cover, make sure that the roadmap is clear. Let's start with the first one. So in the first step that we follow when we start designing this type of system, we need to consider our audience. Who is going to be using the system? Who is going to be accessing it? How they will be accessing it? Are they internal staff or external? And here we have to keep in mind things like claims-based authentication. Anyone used claims-based authentication in their deployment? Okay, excellent. We're going to consider what happens when we have, I guess, a mixture of zones, when it's accessed custom forms-based authentication forms for external parties. I haven't lost anyone yet. Okay, good. I should have changed FBA to forms-based, but that's essentially what I'm talking about. With regards to zones, remember, people will be accessing some static pages via the internet. People will be accessing internally via the intranet, a lot of content, and externally as well. And we'll throw in a couple of kiosk scenarios as well. When you start planning, rolling out SharePoint and SQL to such a scenario that we've covered previously, this is typically the first step that we take, just the analysis. But the next step, we have to think about, are we going with a centralized deployment or decentralized? And here we start, well, what is easier? Are we going to have one central SQL box? Are we going to have 15 web? I already see the nods, that's good. 15 web front ends all in the one place, do some WAN optimizations, and make sure that latency is somehow miraculously resolved. Just breaking the laws of physics a little bit.
Shim, actually, I might stop you there. One thing that, from a security perspective, we should also consider, and there is a SQL Server impact there.
Yeah.
Of course, I've got to put my 2 cents in, right? From a SQL Server's perspective, if you're looking at putting solutions that especially are going to be internal-based and require you to take your authentication right from the client all the way back to the SQL Server, guess what you're working with? Kerberos. Who's heard of that beast? Who's got it successfully working?
I think Aiden.
Okay, that's pretty good. Okay, so all of you guys who don't have it successfully working, work with those guys who do. And I probably will come and talk to you guys as well. It is something that is difficult to get working, but make sure that in your planning for these sites that you do have, the right service principal names registered so that you can carry the authentication forward. The other thing is from a BI perspective. So from a BI perspective, if you're planning to have extranet site, and I believe our company over here was planning to have some extranet BI solutions. So if you're planning to do that, be aware that performance point services, for example, in SharePoint, doesn't natively support forms-based authentication, even though SharePoint does. So how do you go about thinking about making these solutions available? What are the data security considerations?
Don't give away don't give away the last line.
So from a data security perspective, do you want to make available all the data or only part of the data that, based on who's logged in? And there are ways to get around it. One classic way is if you look at the entire Microsoft stack, we've got Forefront Identity Manager, which can help you with that. And then Forefront TMG as well, the gateway services to enable. And we've got some good white papers on how to put that together with the internet or extranet type solution for BI.
Absolutely, and what we have to we actually have to keep in mind is this could also affect a bit of the information architecture of our site. We would actually potentially fiddle with the site structure just so that we have the right content types and the right content databases and site collections closer to where they should be. That's why usage scenario is actually critical. Do we have mainly users that read, users that write, and in what sort of scenario? So the next step, after we've agreed on the audience type, is to design how we're spreading our solution. So 3 offices globally, we're going to get to how we do that. I'm going to talk a little bit about the web application structure, how that is considered. Creating some site collections for different content types, for different content databases, getting ahead of myself here, is actually important, especially when we're talking about team sites. We have a team that's working in Fiji, that's my team, but everyone else is working remotely. Makes a lot of sense when you start to create your web application, your site collections, to consider where that deployment is going to be. When we're talking about extranet and internet, one step further, actually, there's a lot of content publishing done internally and then pushed out externally, so to the company internet site. Things to definitely keep in mind. When we're talking about what options do we have, and I generally simplify that to make things easy. We said the method that didn't work, although was tried as the first option, correct? What's your name, sorry? Wayne. Wayne tried that as the first option. That didn't go so well. Users are in their remote office. They're accessing the web front ends. I listed only one, but the set of web front ends we have in the database servers in their actually data center. Scenario number 2, also see that a little bit. Did you try that, Wayne? Try that as well. How did that work for you? Not great. So it's a good thing I have a third option here. Yeah? All right. Well, we're going to skip the third option. No, we're not going to do that. Where we have the web front ends closed, and then what we have to consider is, I guess, good optimization between those two. Quite often, the scenario that works best is where we actually do have a central SQL server in our data center, but we can also, I guess, take a bit of a branch office model. Those of you that come from a bit of an infrastructure background, where we package the sites used by the team in those remote locations. Obvious problem here, 2 SQL servers. What are we going to do about that?
So I'm glad you talk about that, and I'm glad you're starting to
I was going to answer,
use
but I don't know.
SQL
Like, it's SQL
Server
stuff,
in your
so.
vocabulary a lot more. As a SharePoint guy should, right?
Yes.
SQL Server's king.
I'm going to hide in a corner.
Yeah, go in the corner. So as you can see, this challenge of number 3, architecture, how do we get data replicated between the 2 sites? And it's good to know the SQL Server has replication capabilities inbuilt. In particular, for a SharePoint site, we actually support the sync framework. So sync framework was something that we added to our .NET framework. And essentially, we take advantage of some of the change tracking capability we also introduced in SQL Server 2008 to basically keep track of the deltas or the changes that have taken place. And the sync framework can take advantage of that, take the deltas that have come through and push it forward, not only to SQL Server, but even other sources. And that can be configurable. So SQL can help solve SharePoint problems.
Actually, Shashank did include a nice white paper with lots of SQL queries on how to set that up. Yes?
Yep, absolutely.
Excellent. Next step that I typically go to after I've realized what's our structure for deployment. Let's talk about features. What features are we going to use? In SharePoint, it's an easier, typically an easier decision to make. We have to consider things along the lines, especially since of the deployment scenario that we've covered, things like connectivity and remote management and administration, how we deploy our solutions, especially if we have multiple web front ends and multiple SQL databases. We have to consider availability. We're going to touch on that in a bit more detail. And just as easily, the actual functions. So out of our 75% SharePoint people, unless the balance has changed, you've converted some people to the SQL land. Deployment of SharePoint Foundation, right, show of hands. And SharePoint Standard. And SharePoint Enterprise. Microsoft are loving this session. This is awesome.
Where's the licensing guy when you need it?
We're gonna do an audit afterward. No, just kidding. So a lot of these things would have come up in your considerations. Maybe. The things we are considering typically, capabilities of enterprise search, single sign-on form libraries, business connectivity services I mentioned, and business intelligence as well. I find that it's actually trickier to assess what edition of SQL Server one would need for SharePoint. So Shashank is going to cover that actually, because I think that's a little bit more interesting than SharePoint, I guess, on this particular point.
Yeah, absolutely, because we all know that SharePoint's nothing without SQL Server.
again.
So from a performance perspective, who agrees? If you don't have your SQL Server optimized, there you go. I know Chris would. So one key takeaway, it's the one thing that you take away from this presentation is what I've written in the yellow. For SharePoint 2010 Enterprise implementations, absolutely SQL Server Enterprise Edition is what you need to use. You might go, well, you're Microsoft, of course you're going to say that. You want us to buy Enterprise. No, so what I've seen with customers is essentially what happens with SharePoint. It's such a good product. Yeah, I'm agreeing to SharePoint being a good product. That you typically start off with a deployment where it's for a particular department. You might start off with the marketing department, and they start using it, and guess what? It starts getting viral. Sales guys want to use it. The finance department wants to use it, and it grows. And what happens, all of that traffic has to be hosted and catered to by the SQL Server, because we all know SharePoint doesn't really do the work. It's actually SQL Server, right? All the content gets stored there.
Anyone disagrees with that
all
statement?
All the processing happens there.
Anyone? Yeah. Okay, good. I think we have our first gift.
One person. Hey, that was my stash.
It used to be.
Right. So,
thanks, Wayne.
Anyway, those of you still listening and in reality. So the importance of SharePoint starts increasing and rising within the organization. And I've seen it time and time again. So people will go in, Standard's going to do my job. Or even worse, I think you were saying some people even go with Express.
Yes.
God forbid. Anyway, so they go in and think it's going to work, and fine, it works for the set 5-10 users that are in marketing department, but then guess what? Everyone starts using it, starts hammering SQL Server. SQL Server Express is governed to one CPU, a few gigs of memory, and 10 gigs of database size. So you start hitting that issue. Then you need to think about outage anyway, right? To go off and upgrade to standard or enterprise. So why, this is where my point is, why do you go through that phase of trying to work out or trying to right size for growth? Because we know SharePoint is going to grow. So size with an edition, with Enterprise Edition of SQL that will cater for today's needs as well as growth. And also from an IT perspective, from a management of that infrastructure, SQL Server Enterprise has some great capability. Around the storage aspect, so in the second point here, it itself can repay for your investments in Enterprise Edition. We're seeing on a conservative side, 50 to 60% database compression. And actually, on top of the database compression, we're seeing performance increases, especially for search databases and the property databases. And search is something important to our friends, or the scenario that we talk about. The search was a key category. The other thing is from a remote blob storage, we wanted media content. Now, with integration with Enterprise Edition, we can talk to the remote blob storage API directly. So we can have cheaper hardware storing all your video and documents and rich content like that without it actually affecting your tier 1 storage for your SQL Server databases. So Enterprise Edition allows you to do that. We can take, of course, advantage of file stream in all the other editions, and I hope you're doing that today. But if you're looking at expanding that and going beyond the realms of the storage on your local storage, which is what file stream is limited to, then remote blob storage with Enterprise Edition allows you to do that. The other thing from a version, we all know that 2005 Service Pack 3 onwards is supported for SharePoint 2010. Supportability perspective, you want to be on the latest and greatest. If you're doing a deployment today at SharePoint 2010, go with 2008 R2. Few things, there are performance improvements, of course, with the engine, and also from a BI perspective, we provide a lot more integrated solutions with Power Pivot, which you'll see shortly. And from a high availability perspective, we give additional capabilities in the Enterprise Edition around being able to go up to 16 nodes from a cluster perspective, and in the mirroring, where you have disaster recovery scenario, go into synchronous and asynchronous mode from a performance perspective. Another thing from SharePoint itself, and this is something that gets Shim a bit excited, is around the ability to use content deployment using database snapshot technology in Enterprise Edition. And this is an enterprise-only capability. So this is the ability to take a point-in-time snapshot or a read-only view of the SQL Server content database, and then be able to migrate sites without any downtime, and the ability to also back up those sites and do historical.
I guess SharePoint has the ability to read those loose snapshots that SQL has created.
Yeah, absolutely.
And extract content from it. Using that function, anyone? Attaching a database snapshot? Yeah, excellent. Has the ability to, I guess, give you a bit more flexibility around restoring content as well.
Excellent. So we talked about some of the performance capability and being able to scale as per your requirements. So as going from your enterprise departmental needs to all the way up to your enterprise needs. And that's through a lot of these capability around hot add CPU and hot add memory. So if you're virtualizing your SharePoint environment, how many of you guys, by curiosity? And in terms of SQL as well, are you virtualizing the SQL backend? Yeah. Okay. Cool. So we support dynamic memory allocation with Hyper-V and as well as the VMware hypervisor, and that's the ability to have add additional workload memory to it without any downtime. So as your workload starts increasing, you can go through and configure your guest VM from 8 gigs to 16 gigs without a restart of SQL Server. From manageability perspective, so from an IT perspective, a lot of these operations are online. Security is becoming a lot more of a concern, especially around auditing and meeting SOX compliance and all of those sort of things. Then out of the box with Enterprise Edition, we provide auditing of all your operations. So not only insert, update, deletes, but down to the select operations, who's querying data from your SharePoint databases. And this can become important if your auditors are coming through and want to know who's having access to things. And of course, there's licensing applications from those of you who have put their hand up on around running SQL Server in a virtualized environment. There's benefits of running Enterprise, which gives you for every one license access to about 4 VMs. And we can talk more about that. Licensing can get crazy in itself. But
actually, yeah, I mean, you're covering, this is definitely the exciting parts of SQL Server. I think we all agree. The whole manageability and what was that, snapshots, that was excellent. But I'm actually interested in that before we sort of go into details into that slide. There's the BI component in SQL that I think is potentially a little bit more interesting than snapshots. Yeah, we'll agree on that. So with regards to BI, I think there's an excellent slide here that if Shashank can sort of tell us a little bit about.
Yeah, absolutely. Just let it build. So as we know, and this is probably where the SQL guys get really friendly with the SharePoint guys, BI, from our perspective, is 3 stacks, 3 product sets. The SQL Server and SharePoint plays a central role here. SharePoint essentially becomes the delivery part of our BI solutions, which are hosted out of SQL Server. So
that's a gift to Shashank.
Oh, thanks, man. That's, we have the ability to integrate reporting services into SharePoint and provide essentially the visualization of the data that might be stored in multiple areas within your organization. That might be across in SQL Server itself, it might be in Oracle, it might be in SAP. We're able to bubble all that data up and provide that one interface for users to go and do their data intelligence on top of it. So be able to go off and write their queries, get their reports delivered, be it in a dashboard form, be it in a scorecard form, be it in visual services. This, to me, is one of the exciting parts of SharePoint, which allows you to visualize the data in the way that's most representative to your business. So if you're a retail store outlet or you want to monitor where your items are selling the fastest, and you can have a Visio map of your retail outlet and actually have the data visualize and show out red if certain items are not selling well versus other items that might be selling well. So you have all of that capability. Then we have what we added with SQL Enterprise 2008 R2, this whole capability around Power Pivot, so self-service BI. Who uses Power Pivot here or has heard of Power Pivot?
Who's attended a presentation that included SQL that didn't show Power Pivot? This is not a different session, by the way. We're going to show a bit of Power Pivot as well.
We'll show a bit of Power Pivot for those who haven't seen Power Pivot. But essentially, Power Pivot enables you to go off and get data from multiple sources and work with that, and essentially create a data model and also publish reports based on top of it. So I'll show you a quick demo of that. So as you can see, SharePoint from a BI perspective is very key to our offering. So where are we? Let's switch over to 2. So we're in Excel here. This is Excel 2010. Power Pivot comes in as a free add-in. So we've got at the top, it adds a bar, essentially another ribbon add-in called Power Pivot. And these are the sort of reports that you can create with Power Pivot data behind it. So essentially what we've got is a set of slices that's available in Excel. And we can start querying this data. The data we're looking at here is movie data. So this is actually based on our Xbox Live data of how much, which country purchased certain movies versus another. So we're quickly being able to, filter through that or slice through the data. If I click the Power Pivot window, it takes me to another Excel-like looking like window, essentially set of rows and columns. But here we're working with lots and lots of data. So we're working with actually hundreds of millions of rows in the back end. And this is all being done all right on my laptop itself. So I'm not connected to any server. The data has been brought in and it's in memory, highly compressed. So you're able to work with it in a very agile way. So I can sort it, I can filter the data, and it's all happening. That's 100 million rows getting all sorted. You can see that I can get data from multiple sources. So it's from either SQL Server itself, from Access, analysis services, from reports. A lot of business users look at reports and they go, okay, I actually wish I could get the back-end data of that. I don't really care too much about the format, but I want to be able to get the data and be able to manipulate and work with it. And so you're able to get all this data from multiple sources, not including non-SQL sources. So it might be Oracle or Teradata or Sybase. So you can see that you're able to go off and get data from multiple sources and start creating data models. And once you've done that, you can go off and into your familiar pivot table environment, as I was, and we can start creating reports like this.
I understand that the data comes from various places, and for me, there's always that confusion of Power Pivot on the client versus Power Pivot on the server. What really happens when I take a marvelous Excel spreadsheet like this and publish it to a SharePoint site or something? What's really happening there?
Yeah, good question. So we can.
All the questions are good. What do you mean?
So once the end user goes off and creates a Excel Power Pivot based report or a data model, he or she can go off and save it back to SharePoint. And when they go back and save it to SharePoint, essentially what it does is it takes that XLSX file and it sees that there is actually a Power Pivot solution in there. And essentially what happens is SharePoint needs to be configured for it to successfully work. SharePoint 2010 needs to be configured with SQL Server analysis services running in the back end, and it runs in a special integrated mode. And when it does that, it goes off and detects that the XLSX file has this special cube essentially inside it, and this cube then goes off and gets extracted into the analysis services database in the back end.
So SharePoint actually creates an analysis services cube?
It does, yeah. So it'll go through and create that, and then the next subsequent users that come through and view this data or try to slice and dice the data, it's all happening on the server. So you're taking advantage of the server's memory as opposed to it all being on the client. Just another interesting one I was running this morning. So this is just to show you the types of data that you can actually interact with. So here's a Twitter feed. So if you want to do some social analytics, and I just did this for the #AU TechEd feed, and the @SQL Server and @SharePoint. And you can see that actually it was pretty interesting to see. Prior to TechEd, a lot of people were tweeting up until the 31st of August, and all of a sudden there was a sharp decline, and it's sort of going ahead, and hopefully people are tweeting in our particular session.
I saw a couple actually.
So yeah, you saw a couple. That's good.
But can you remove AU TechEd for a second?
Can I remove it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I can go through and filter. Oh, sorry, I just kept that. And so I can go through and filter which particular tweets I want to look at and look at. The other thing I've done here is not only being able to bring in these tweets, I'm able to add a tone dictionary. So I can look for keywords and say, okay, a particular key, if a tweet has the word amazing on it, that means it's pretty positive. If it's all bad words like poor and attacked, and obviously you can use your own vocabulary here and put some.
You can put -11.
Some more
SQL
horrible.
Or something.
Oh yeah, I'll get
11
you back.
SharePoint.
So, and you can see that the analytics by tone instead. So if you want to look at all the people who said nasty things about you, or this is good things, or and who it was, you're able to go down and drill down to that level. So it's a pretty interesting way, as you can see. It's not only structured data. You could be working with unstructured data like Twitter feeds and the likes. Oh, just one more thing. Just a sneak peek of what's happening in Denali, or the next version of SQL Server and SharePoint. So I showed you the ability to have movie data and lots of it. So next thing we can do is visualize that through SharePoint 2010, is visualize it through a tool called Project Crescent. Anybody heard of this code word? Yeah, cool. All right, so just to show you a quick, those of you who haven't, Project Crescent, and not to be confused with the food croissant, or it is Project Crescent at the moment. Hopefully we come up with a better name. But it's a tool that looks like this. Essentially, it's based in SharePoint. It's a Silverlight-based UI, and it provides essentially on the right-hand side the same set of data models, if you like, that I created in Power Pivot, and the ability to just drag and drop that data in. So if I now want to look at all the box office data, I'm able to go through and just click on that, and it has some default views that IT has already set for me. So rather than me having to work out, oh, do I need to look at this column and add that column, one click and you get a nice default view, including images. Images are supported with the Project Crescent. I can go through and change sizing and do some filtering, change the layout of it. So there's nice new graphical rich ways of showing this data. So here we're seeing it in a card type manner. And all of the definition as to how the title lays out and all of that is done at the back end. The end user doesn't really need to know any of that. It just automatically promotes the field, like the title of the movie should be up at the title of the card, for example. And then when we go in, add another field here, if I want to look at movies by rating, first of all, it'll start it as a tabular mode. But then once we do that, it gives me options here of being able to change it to columns or different formats. So now I moved it to a column chart. And all of these components are interactive. So if I click on and filter a particular area, I'm able to go through and filter on it. So before I do that, I'm going to just bring in some data about genres, the revenues, and change that into a column chart, and then eventually into a scatter chart. So, 1 second. So as you can see, we can now have multiple dimensions on a chart, and then you have a scatter chart at the bottom. That just visually represents the data. So this is a tool that allows you to explore the data rather than in rows and columns in a very graphical manner. So hopefully that's given you a bit of a whirlwind tour of what's in BI.
I actually think that what really everyone's interested in is, yes, these can be web parts down the track. This is really where it really does matter. No?
Yeah, no.
Anyone agrees? Thank you. I rest my case.
Okay, I'll save the best for last.
I know.
So one thing that we've actually done from a BI perspective, we actually bundle all of this so you don't, as SharePoint guys or architects, don't have to worry about what are the bits and what are the components that will fit together. We actually created an appliance called the HP Business Decision Appliance. Who has seen it out in the showcase? We've got it out there. Yeah, a few of you. So it's actually just sleek machine, I'm thinking of carrying it on my back. It's good for demos. No, just kidding. It's not that portable. But essentially, it's a 1U server with DL360, basically with 96 gigs of RAM. It has about 1.2 terabytes of usable storage space. has SharePoint 2010 preloaded, Windows, of course, and SQL Server Enterprise, of course, and all pre-integrated with the Power Pivot solutions ready to go. So you can start delivering, have your users collaborating on BI-based solutions.
Just actually on that, before we touch on the next topic. So this was a relatively a longer piece, but it's important to look at it from that perspective. It's important to decide which editions you're going to plan with early. Of course, going enterprise across the board makes your life a little bit easier. But the points that Shashank was raising are very relevant to some of the points we're going to bring up soon. So you got to assess the features as well. After you know audience type, zones, distribution, and I guess the decentralized approach we're going for deployment for our sample company, the features we're going to leverage in SharePoint and in SQL, putting together, I guess, the right servers and the right software. The next thing that we typically jump to is discussing high availability and disaster recovery. When it comes to SharePoint, there's a couple of things that you can do, and working with multiple web front ends is an obvious benefit, that you can take one down, administration or some maintenance work, and bringing back up and use that effectively. Same thing goes to application servers or search servers or Excel calc servers, and if you do spread that in your farm using several servers, you have that option to throw in more servers to the farm and take them out as you need them. When it comes to SQL Server, there's more options. When it comes to clustering, when it comes to mirroring, we're talking about a few of these in a bit more detail. Do you want to perhaps sort of summarize that for us?
So from a SharePoint perspective, again, SQL being available is very critical, right?
True.
Yeah, so we can't actually have SharePoint sites available without the SQL database being available. So we have to think of the holistic side. So it's no point having a farm of web front-end servers and no availability at the SQL Server level. So SQL, from a SharePoint perspective, two big native high availability solutions are supported, which is essentially clustering and database mirroring. And that's for your local high availability. If you're thinking of disaster recovery solutions across to multiple different sites, data centers, then you need to look at possibly stretch failover clustering. Curious just who's used clustering here? And stretch failover clustering as well? Okay, I'll cover that shortly, so I'll hold that thought. So database mirroring or log shipping, more traditional ways of doing the SQL Server disaster recovery. Just curious, who does synchronous database mirroring across to multiple different sites? Wow.
Cool, Wayne. You had like the worst implementation
Wayne does
ever.
everything.
Very good. Wow.
If you get it to work, okay. So database replication from a HA or DR perspective, not recommended at all. It's not a solution that is meant for that purpose. So we'll make sure it's highlighted. Don't use that. So what does multi-site failover clustering look like? And this was the question that was asked as well. So we have two sites here, site 1 and site 2. For a multi-site clustering to work in today's implementation of products, or availability of products with SQL Server 2008 R2 and Windows Server 2008 R2, is we need what's known as a stretched VLAN. So that's essentially, that's essentially saying that my IP network or IP subnet looks the same whether you're running on site 1 or whether it's at site 2. So to the cluster itself, it looks like it is running in the same data center. So you need to do a bit of fooling to make it work. Now the other thing that you need in a cross-site cluster is SAN replication, or some sort of storage level replication to take place between the two sites. And so basically what happens is, in a failure, it would actually, the nodes or a single node at site 1 would go down. The IP address will essentially transfer across to the other side, and that will continue to work. Now, the good news is here that in SQL Server Denali, we changed this and finally support what Windows Server has been able to support since 2008, which is the multi-subnet clustering scenario. So what this means, we still need the replication at the disk level, but what we don't need any longer is the ability or the requirement to have a stretched VLAN or the IP address to look exactly the same or be in the same range across both the sites. That in itself is networking guys typically don't like to do that. It opens up, from a security perspective, opens up additional things that they don't really want to have. And also from an administration perspective, it creates a bit of an overhead. But with SQL Server Denali, the next version, will be able to support what's known as an OR dependency. So if your IP address at in site 1 was 10 dot based, and at site 2 was 192 based, we are able to support that essentially through an OR dependency at the SQL Server level. SQL Server will know, smart enough, if I can't get a 10 dot IP address, I'll try and bind to a 192 IP address and continue to be available to my applications. So we have that. Today, from a disaster recovery perspective, I mentioned we have database mirroring and log shipping. So let's take this as a scenario where at the primary data center, we may have database mirroring, which allows you to, with a witness, to have automatic failover. And this happens at the database level, so it's pretty fast. And then for the remote side, if the primary data center was to go down, we have periodic log shipping happening, which is essentially every 20 minutes or every 30 minutes have the transaction log of the SQL Server database being backed up and restored across on the disaster recovery side at that same interval. So again, we have some good news in this area. So one of the issues around that is configuring two different sets of technology. How do I get mirroring, and how do I now work log shipping, and how does it work when it's there's no automated failover capability to the other side when it comes to if the primary site was to go down, log shipping would need to be initiated through a set of stored procedures. So again, with Denali, just for the SharePoint guys here to let you know about what's coming up in Denali, is we replace both of these capabilities with what's known as availability group. This is a new concept which essentially allows you to not only have availability at a single database level, but this is multiple databases together. So you can actually say, if I have multiple content database, or the content database and the configuration database, for example, I want that to fail over at the same time in case there's a problem at the primary site. I can now say that in an availability group. I can actually create both of those together, define that, and then have the failover happening.
So that you don't end up in a scenario where you have content databases spread across two different environments.
Absolutely. The other things we bring in is the ability to use your secondary machine. So they're not just waiting there for your failover to happen. You could farm out your read-only or your reporting queries, your BI workload to the secondary servers. And we can have up to 4 of those secondary servers. So just go to the next slide. So this is essentially what it looks like. It actually takes advantage of Windows Server failover clustering. And essentially, it's not in the traditional way. You don't need to have shared storage. You don't need to have SCSI connections into that or any of those special things that a typical failover cluster would need. All it creates is like the network name, a virtual network name, virtual IP address to let the SharePoint application or any of your applications know where SQL Server is actually up and running. And so that's essentially handled by the Windows Server failover clustering, similar to if you've ever worked with Exchange as well. So we're going down a similar sort of architecture there. But what's happening at the SQL Server level is essentially it is doing similar things to database mirroring today. So it actually runs in either synchronous mode or asynchronous mode to a secondary. And as I mentioned, you can have up to 4 secondaries. So you can actually have the primary replicating to the secondary on the one side, or you could even have multiple secondaries on the one side and then only one disaster recovery or a combination thereof. So what that allows is, from a management perspective, in SQL Server, you right-click and you fail over or fail back to whichever secondary you need to in a fairly easy manner. That's the high availability capabilities.
Just by the way, we are monitoring some of the tweets here, and Vivek is telling us we need some more Crescent demos other than movie sales. Microsoft are working on a
there are
Microsoft
lots more,
on a bicycle sales as well. It's like,
yeah.
and Chandler is actually craving a croissant after your comments, so thanks for that. That was good.
Okay.
I'm craving a croissant as well.
So let's move on. Thanks for your comment.
No worries.
Okay.
It's not me, it's Vivek and Chandler here.
So SQL Server, again, I'll stress, is very important to the SharePoint environment, and getting that right affects the performance of your SharePoint environment. So with that comes the sizing of your environment. And we'll go through showcasing a sizing wizard that from one of the vendors. But from a SQL Server perspective, again, I would recommend to have a dedicated SQL Server environment if it's an enterprise-wide deployment of SharePoint. Essentially, it becomes the single point for all of the storage, all of the content for SharePoint. From a disk configuration, because again, that's the three resources that affect SQL Server performance is CPU, memory, and disk. CPU and memory is pretty much you can take for granted today. Most of the servers today, multi-core servers, you're going to have at a minimum 8 to 16 cores, and that caters for a pretty sizable workload. Memory, you can see servers with 24 gigs, 32 gigs, 64 gigs of memory is fairly common. It's pretty commodity. But getting the disk subsystem right from a database is really important for its performance and eventually the performance of the application or SharePoint in this case. And this to me is a big point, because even from a DBA perspective, there's not much you can control directly, because there's the involvement of a SAN vendor or the SAN administrator, and getting what you request. So even as a DBA, you might go, okay, I need a RAID 1 or RAID 10 or RAID 5. But you don't know how they're carving things up. So you need to really make sure you're working with these guys and getting what you ask for. Doing testing, there are tools that, from a SQL perspective, we provide like SQL IO stress and IO meter to let you actually understand that you're going to get the IOs that you require.
If we're thinking about the scenario we have at the moment, if you recall, we have the SMEs coming in, publishing material. We might have a bit of a bit of feeds coming into the system, so it's more of an interactive setup. If we had that luxury of designing the disk configuration for those sites, let's say we have one environment which is the internet site, and one environment which is more of their interactive SME setup. What's your name? Greg. So if we are talking about that, I guess that scenario of collaboration, and you had the luxury of choosing a disk configuration, what would you think would work best? If it's mainly reads, in a collaborative environment, there'll be sort of simultaneous reads and writes. Sorry? As many spindles as you can get. Yes, that's always the case.
Well, no. Throw out a
winning a hat. This is this is you should have practiced throwing actually.
And it's not an old one. It's Gears of War. It's got the defect. Don't worry, I haven't won it.
A couple of years on eBay is going to go through the roof. Yeah. So when it comes to that flexibility, and there's quite a few good articles on that, on sizing. Do you want to say anything else on sizing specifically? Like for instance, the 10 PB I think is an important point.
Yeah, the important point here. So few easy counters that you can. So if you're working with your DBAs and or your SAN administrators, and they're saying, yeah, I've done everything from a SAN perspective. A few things that you can actually test yourself is to look for using performance monitor counters in Windows Server. Open that up. Use average disk per second for the read and writes, and you should see an average or the return of the first data should be around the 20 millisecond mark. So you can do some good, your own benchmarking of your I/O system. If it's worse than that, then you need to work with your SAN administrators and get all of that fixed out. Other things from best practices from an I/O perspective: align the file system to your actual disk offset. Windows Server 2008 actually and onwards does this automatically for you. So when you format a disk, it'll actually format it and align the offset automatically for you. But prior to that, if you're running Windows Server 2003, which SharePoint doesn't support anyway, but just for any of your other environments, use diskpart and tools like that to align that. Other things from I/O prioritization. So main things that SharePoint workload looks for is tempDB, performance at the tempDB level. That's essentially used for a lot of the sorting that takes place. And so making sure that's performant. Then the actual log files, because in the database world, we write to the log files first, and then it gets written into the actual data files. And then the search databases, and then finally the actual content database data files. So it's important to get that sizing, get the performance of that in that order. If you had to sort of choose, or you had to work within bounds of constrained I/Os.
There's also, Shashank was mentioning the, are you familiar with this tool? Anyone here familiar with this tool?
There is.
Excellent. Anyone knows how to resize a screen too? No? Yes, I got it. Essentially, we might go through, you have to remind me the name of the company again. It had a K. It didn't have a K. So this tool allows us to actually put in some of the, is that correct?
That's
Good.
right.
We're going to put you in mid-market. And it actually is a wizard-driven tool that allows you in the end to go and say, we already upgraded you to 1,500 users, to put in the parameters. And actually, some of these you leave as default, some of these you change. So if you're not really certain, you can go with a bit of defaults. But I'm just going to whip through these. I'm not going to go into too much details. There's some percentage of usage, which is quite handy. There's a couple of questions here that you may want to answer.
The most important ones, whether you're using performance point and BI, all of those, you want to say yes.
Of course.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm
None
going
of
to
the
skip that.
SharePoint
No, that's
features.
fine. High availability, absolutely. And you do all that, and in the end, you get a price, which is very nice. Are we going Intel only? Is that was Shashank's preference?
No, that was my preference.
Okay. Hyper-V, etc. And when you get to the end of this, it actually goes and does some calculations for you. And in the end, it gives you a bit of information on the actual servers, and you can go through the full solution calculation, which gives you a report, which you can then take to procurement and actually explain why you want to spend $200,000 on hardware. It actually sells itself. It's pretty good. But this one in the actual configuration actually factors in. Have a look at these, right? It factors in some of the points that we were discussing so far. So as far as sizing tools go, it's an excellent start. I strongly recommend it. And there is a link to that tool. We did the demo? No, we already did that. That's fine. So definitely recommend sort of bouncing your initial thoughts against it. The other thing is we want to talk about content storage. And content storage is a little bit different, for me at least, from the sizing consideration. We want to keep in mind the potential growth of our site collections. SharePoint 2010 pre-Service Pack 1 had a limitation of how much? Do I say that? Cool, excellent. What was that? Who said that? 200 gig. Excellent. We have a price. Oh.
Don't throw this.
I wanted to keep that. Okay, never mind. No, I'm not going to throw this. Yeah, that's true. So, but in post-Service Pack 1, it's actually 4 terabytes. The recommendation remains 200 gig, which I probably, not that it means much, but I would support that recommendation, not to exceed that. But you do have a bit more flexibilities. Don't forget that you have a lot of room for growth with regards to content databases. And one of the things that I learned a few weeks ago from one of my colleagues, which I think is here somewhere, Andrew, that said when you're doing client extranets and you're doing for each client you have two options, really. You can do a site for a client, or you can do a site collection. Instinctively, I would go with site, because there's no need to do a site collection for one customer, one client extranet, because there isn't that much content, or at least in the way I think about it. But there's one thing that actually can be seen across sites that you may not want to share. So security is very important, and client A will never be able to see client B's information. But there's one thing that client A could potentially see of client B, and that is, anyone can care to guess, except for Andrew? Okay, Andrew, guess. You're not going to get a gift, though. What's that? The user groups, is that? Yes. Correct. See? Some good people in the audience. Excellent. And you can actually see the names of the user groups depending on your permissions. And usually the names of the user groups will be the name of your customers, visitors, members, owners, potentially. And you can actually see the names of all your other customers, and you want to restrict that. With that limitation of 32,000, when you reach 32,000 customers, you're no longer 1,500 staff. You should be happy. You shouldn't worry about those sorts of things. Just get another farm, right? But until you're at that point, site collections for each one of your client sites is actually a good approach. So thanks, Andrew, for that as well, and you guys. That's when it comes to content. One thing to remember, and I know it's pretty obvious, SharePoint 2010 has been around for a while. If you do set up some content types and site columns and things like that, and you want to share across site collections, that is possible in SharePoint 2010 using the syndication feature. You're all familiar with that? Yes? Excellent. I'm not going to cover that in too much detail because it's all SharePoint functionality and Shashank might not enjoy. This is an example of our intranet. And in our intranet, we have this sort of pretty typical breakdown. But this is not what is interesting. You can see the navigation. But what I wanted to show you is actually the way we work with our site collections. We're giving them friendly names because when you open SQL, it all gets confusing. It's nice to see a nice familiar name. We give the databases.
So lame SharePoint users. Oh, sorry, did I say that loud?
No, you didn't. Can you turn his volume down? We create. Sorry, man. I'm just kidding. We create content databases for the site collections. And are you familiar with that capability of starting and stopping them at the right time? Should I cover that? Yes. Essentially, when I create a content database and it's in started mode. As I create site collections, they all go into this content database. If I want to create a new site collection that goes to a different content database, I'm going to actually stop the database, which may sound a bit alarming, but we're not actually stopping the database. We're just stopping that from further growth. And we create a new one and start it. So the two content databases are assigned to my SharePoint farm, I guess, or to my application. But the site collections are now starting to be from now on are created under the WSS content clients. So the way we set it up is created the WSS content for, I guess, our main site. And we have 4 site collections on our main site, which is pretty normal. We've done operations and project web access and sales, and all of these have their one site collection. When it came to clients, going back to that explanation that we've given previously, stopped all the other ones, created a new database, started it. And now when we create client site collections, they create new database. They're created on this database. This is actually handy for archiving as well. This is handy when you want to think about how am I going to spread this across different locations with our distributed approach for databases potentially. And when it comes to how that links back to SQL,
yeah, thanks.
Shashank's going to tell us a bit more.
Again, the more important part of the presentation.
The one with the words, not the pretty images.
So actually one thing that Shim mentioned, I forgot to mention, is on the content databases, we recommend creation of multiple data files for your actual SharePoint databases and of equal size. Because SQL Server can actually stripe the data across these multiple data files and grow it as in a consistent manner as well. What that means, again, from that I/O perspective, it spreads it and parallelizes it across the multiple data files. So recommend that. Now, on the other slide, some of the SQL Server configurations that you should be aware of for the content database specifically is that SQL Server by default will create or enable auto-create and auto-update statistics. It'll have those 2 things on there. something that you want to go off and make sure it doesn't, because SharePoint, we've actually coded in the actual queries itself for SharePoint databases certain what we call hints or query hints to actually tell it how to behave and how to go off and get that data. And so that sort of messes up with SQL Server's own auto intelligence around this. So we recommend that you have that disabled. Next thing is around parallelization of queries. We've actually, again, SharePoint likes to do things serially. I think it's a bit like shim, just one thing at a time. Max dot of 1 is a server-wide setting which sets that max degree of parallelism. It essentially disables it, and rather than running queries across multiple CPUs, it might be a bit counterintuitive, but it's a bit like even our BizTalk products. We actually recommend the use of max dot 1 for that as well. The next one's pretty interesting. It helps you from a maintenance and high availability and recovering from high availability. Who's heard of aliases at SQL Server level? Yeah, okay. The same guys who put their hand up on SQL side. Okay. The aliases are essentially a way of saying, rather than using the actual computer name or the host name of where SQL Server resides, we can actually use a alternate name, sort of like an alias, or sort of like in a synonym or so, to connect off to that server. So what that means is if that server was to go have a problem for any reason, rather than SharePoint connecting to the actual hard-coded host name, which connects to the alias name, you can change this underlying computer name. You can reinstall or install a new computer name and replace it in its place. SharePoint will continue to work because it's connecting to the alias. All you need to do is update that alias to the new computer name. So it allows you to do easy management of that environment. From an auto-growth setting, again, affects I/O performance of your SharePoint database environment. By default, SQL Server will put things at 10% auto growth for data files. Now, this is great for smaller databases, but things like content databases, especially when you're talking when it gets to 200 gigs, which is what some of the recommendations should be talked about. Make sure you use, if you can imagine, you use the percentage to grow every time. 200 gigs, 10% is 20 gigs. It's going to try and allocate 20 gigs every time it needs additional space. That obviously can take some time and block your IOs from taking place. So put that to a fixed size that makes sense in terms of the amount, sort of, how your capacity in your environment is growing, how much unstructured data is actually coming into that environment. It's not so much of an issue for the search and property databases, but definitely from the content database perspective. This question?
Repeat the question.
For the normal content databases, what's a good growth? So it's still, I would recommend, it's a general, actually, best practice from a SQL perspective, rather than using percentage values, because every time the database grows, it's the percentage of that database growth. Sorry? What's a good gigabyte figure? It's what have you seen? Sorry?
Between 1 and 5.
Between 1 and 5, yeah,
but
I would say.
It depends. So if your documents are huge, or that there's lots of videos being uploaded, potentially doubling in size is an option. But it's something that you need to consider that will happen. It's also about the planning up front and how much you allocate, pre-allocate. But let's say you know your database is going to grow to a certain size, and you've planned it properly. The odds of you needing another 10% afterwards, especially when we're talking large sizes, are pretty rare. You'd start thinking about how you distribute your content into another content database close to that point. If not, though, you'll say, okay, well, 1 to 5 databases perhaps will just facilitate my quota that I've assigned through the SharePoint site. That's in my experience, but it really does depend.
Right. No, so auto-grow will happen as the database requires. You can have scheduled, you can keep on adding data files at a scheduled time, for example, if you needed to do that at a SQL Server level. But if you, so if you don't do auto-grow, then you have to make sure you manually have some processes. And you can schedule that through SQL Agent, for example. So you could say,
Which is similar to
Uh, well, what do you mean by that?
Using scheduling.
In an auto-grow scenarios, like if one gigabyte for one giga data queue, let's say it's not enough space all around.
Yeah.
So in a similar scenario that for next days, if I say that on a day, on a typical day, you will have a capacity to improve by 10. And if that's not there, I can increase it automatically over.
So
Have similar functionality.
So that is sort of what the auto grow functionality would do, right?
Otherwise, when really the request
When the issue's there, but
this one, what I'm talking about is like upfront autograph.
So the question is, I want the out-of-growth action not to happen while everyone's writing to the database. I want it to happen at night, ideally before we reach that point.
yeah, so you
And
can.
there is-
So that's what I was saying. So you could use SQL Agent and schedule
To check
when-
how much you have remaining.
Because autogrow is an inbuilt functionality you don't configure.
Oh, yeah, you'd be writing it, yeah.
But in
With
this
SQL
case,
Agent,
upfront,
you'd.
would you be able to do something which is configurable?
Yeah, running a query to increase the size
Yeah,
of the
so it's
database.
right, creating a query, scheduling it to run it with SQL Agent. It's essentially of the few lines of code, or T-SQL.
There's just two other topics actually we want to cover, and I'm also looking at James Bowman's question that we weren't 100% clear on the options for replication in a branch office scenario, and I want to address that. We'll just cover quickly the next two slides because we have about 10 minutes, and then we'll stay here. Shashank's flight's only at 5 p.m. and he can delay it, not a problem. So he'll stay here answering questions.
Yeah, absolutely.
But the two other important points, at least for me, and we'll get back to James's question as well as anyone else that may have one, on the ongoing archival and governance policies. And I'm actually talking about moving forward, especially 1,500 staff in our company. A team is going to come to IT and say, we need a SharePoint site like desperately. We need it right now. We're going to use it every day, we promise. And we need 500 gig at least because that's our day one growth. And they're going to get that database because we're trying to be nice, but they're not going to use it and they're not going to, use all that information. And after 6 months, they haven't really done much with it. So the whole concept of archiving content that exists using third-party tools as well as using SharePoint usage analytics will allow you to be on top of that and know pretty early on that you want to archive that content. I'm going to leave the slide sort of a little bit hanging. I will talk about data migration as well because you always have that initial content that you start from. So just remember that you're not starting from zero 9 times out of 10. You're not starting from zero and people start uploading content. You start from, I guess, an initial starting point. There's quite a few good tools that help you load that content in. From that moment, you have to apply your policies for archiving and governance in general. I know that was like the fastest slide on governance you've ever heard, so I apologize for that, but I'm happy to answer a few questions on that a little bit afterwards. Another important thing which we face from time to time, you set up a SharePoint platform, the ongoing support of it, SQL and SharePoint is very important. I'll give you an example. If an administrator spends an hour a week on a SharePoint file making sure that the health monitor and everything, the event log, everything is healthy, that saves 4 months down the track because we've seen instances where for 4 months no one did any of that. 4 months down the track is 2-3 weeks worth of work of remediation when the system is in a bad condition. So that 1 hour a week is worthwhile. When it comes to SQL, it's a little bit more complex, right? So Shashank is going to give us, I guess, in a couple of
actually, what's
small points.
What's been happening in SharePoint 2010 is the health analyzer has been a great add-in. And the health analyzer takes care of a lot of that maintenance that needed to take place in SQL Server. Especially the main things from a SQL database perspective, the reorganization or where the indexes are and how healthy the indexes are, that affects the direct performance of SharePoint interaction. So that is actually now built into Health Analyzer, and it evaluates the statistics on a daily basis and provides that information. Previously, there wasn't that in 2007. But apart from that, you should, as Shim was mentioning, regularly do a DBCC check DB to check the logical structure of your consistency of your database. Defragment indexes, especially for the all docs table, because that's where your unstructured data goes, so like your documents, Excel files, Word files. And then monitor the performance of your SQL Server and performance. essentially through CPU monitoring, memory and disk. There's a link there that has all of the exact counters that you should be looking at countering. If not, if you don't use that, use System Center Operations Manager in your environment to monitor. And you can automate a lot of that maintenance via the maintenance visit, the SSIS, with SQL Server Integration Services. There's a maintenance capability which you can say how often do you want to run this on a weekly basis, what do you want to do? Do you want to just check the database integrity, rebuild the indexes, reorganize the indexes, and where you go. So it's pretty easy visit.
Who's actually, bless you, who's actually using or doing that weekly or monthly review of SQL and SharePoint? Just SQL? So you know how to...
The more important part, right? He deserves the book, yeah.
There's a pocket guide for SQL Server. It appears to be a product of some sort. I'm not really sure. That's not fair, right? Because actually these sorts of things
because he actually realizes that SQL is required for the performance of SharePoint.
Yeah, I'm aware of that. While we do the summary, I really want to answer James Bowen's question because if we weren't clear on that, that's actually interesting. And that is, what options do we have when we are thinking of an office? Where's James, by the way? Okay, because on Twitter you have a little icon, I couldn't recognize you. So the question is really, if we do go with a remote site that has a SharePoint web front end, a SQL Server, and our data center has a centralized SQL Server, what options do I have to link the two? And we're talking about essentially two options. I'm just going to repeat them, make sure that they're quite clear.
Yeah.
If we say that the team has its own area of focus, and in that they're working just on their team site and they need instant response, and we know that head office will need to have access to do that, to see that information, maybe not so much write, or maybe write as well from time to time, we consider having the content database and the site collection at the site level and synchronize it using log shipping, most likely, back to the data center. If we are looking at more of a collaborative between head office and one of the remote offices, that gets a bit more complex. And that's where Shashank was talking about the sync framework, exactly. So there is a very good article in our slide deck that actually shows how to use sync framework for SharePoint. And that allows you to do a bit of, I guess, synchronization between two locations. It has a few limitations, but it's one step more than disaster recovery.
Yeah.
Does that answer the question?
I guess where the confusion may have come up is in my latest slide for the HA and DR, I say don't use replication. So that's from a high availability and disaster recovery capability. Replication at the SQL Server level is not, I mean, there is ways you can make it work, but it's very tedious and it's very manual. It's not.
That doesn't interact with the sync framework.
No, it does.
Different.
That's different. So for the specific scenario that Shim just went through, which is all about synchronizing content databases, that's fine because you're just synchronized. That's not a high availability solution. You can, for an HA solution, still use clustering underneath that or database mirroring underneath that.
Yeah. And you could have that, I guess, at that branch office if it's a fairly large office. How many people do we have in Fiji? 300? I'm better with 3, by the way. I don't want too many people cramping my style in Fiji, right? But say 300, that warrants having 2 SQL servers potentially, maybe having, I guess, a couple of virtual machines, high availability but not 100%, and looking after that. And if something bad happens, we go to the main site. So it's just a little bit slower.
You're suggesting that branch office in the corporate headquarters, you can have like content databases synced without replication.
That is correct, yes.
Third-party replication.
Correct. Correct.
Okay.
Going to cover that in a bit more detail. There's a bit of a typo here, but I'm just going to go through that. Design of SQL Server infrastructure is important. That's in our summary. It doesn't affect the performance of SharePoint. It affects the performance of SQL. I think it's a bit of a typo.
It's not a typo at all.
It has a knock-on effect a little bit on SharePoint, but it's strong enough to recover. Availability of SQL is affected by it. The functionality of SQL is affected by it. And as importantly, there's choose focus around user adoption. Do you want to cover that?
You run your SharePoint on text files, and we'll see how you go. Right?
Anyone used web storage system? 2001 days? No? It's a story for a different time. So going back to our roadmap in one quick, I guess, whip through and then talking about
and
a few more
don't
prizes.
forget,
We have one important
major prize.
We went through the audience type. We considered what we're going to do. We documented it, looked at centralized, decentralized. We've come up with the ideal model. We looked at the features that we're going to leverage, and based on that, decided which additions we're going to use. Did a bit of planning on how do we fail over in case of a disaster, and how do we keep the availability high by using multiple web front ends, multiple app servers. We were talking about the sizing, how we actually allocate the right size to the database, to the servers, how we ensure that the content configuration in the site structure takes advantage of, well, leverages, I guess, the sizes that we were talking about. We were talking about how moving forward we want to archive information that isn't used. That way we're going back to our benchmark from time to time. What are we doing on an ongoing support mechanism? Wayne, if you follow these steps, are you going to have a successful deployment?
Most likely.
He already won one award.
SharePoint will not fail, but I know SQL.
Oh.
He deserves another prize. That's all I can say. So, what can I say, right?
All right, he's not allowed in
my
the
job,
DB
my work here
tracks.
is done.
I wouldn't go.
Next year we have Wayne here instead of us.
Hostile crowd here.
Excellent. So there's a good few resources. In the template, they decided to use Blue for hyperlinks. I apologize for that. But please
Let's
tell
get
me.
to the prize, mate. So, do you
No,
wanna announce
we
it?
need a good question
We
for
need
this
good
prize, so
question
this is a
for
pretty
this
good
prize.
one. Yes, sorry.
All that's great and everything. Once you lift out this backup, what's more important, SQL backup or SharePoint backup?
Ooh, good question.
Excellent points. That's what happens when we skip through the archival sort of slide. Okay.
High availability and DA and whatever.
SQL never goes down.
Let's talk
That's
about
a SharePoint
let's talk
problem.
about backup because backup is an important point. The options you have for backup, there's actually too many, or I guess quite a few that you want to consider. Essentially, in my experience, backup is actually driven from your restore scenarios. What sort of restore scenarios you need to cater for. SharePoint 2010 does give you a lot of flexibility. The snapshot approach is a good one if you don't want to use any third-party tools. If you do, I've actually mentioned, if you go in one of the slides, I've actually mentioned a few of the third-party tools. I had to sort of run through them. But native SharePoint backup on a daily basis, SQL snapshots to complement that when it's necessary, transaction logs, sort of a mixture of I guess, those three will give you, I guess, an all-inclusive restore mechanism.
Because the
You know I
SharePoint
say that.
backup
So the
takes-
question is SharePoint backup more important? But you can load content databases and extract specific items from it at the restore. Sorry? Yes. Yes, but with no downtime. If I do you understand?
Yeah. So I think to summarize, it would be a SharePoint backup, because that SharePoint backup includes a backup of your
All inclusive? Yeah.
SQL database. But I think to be all covered, you should always, as a best practice, also back up your SQL Server level, right? So if at any point it's an issue at the SQL level, you're able to just restore at the SQL Server database and continue to work instead of doing a restore of your entire SharePoint footprint as well. So hopefully that's.
I do both at the moment.
Yeah.
Yeah, we should
I think
actually take that offline. Anyone here has any comments
Yeah.
on backing up that would be relevant to mention in this context? A successful.
For
No such thing
backup,
as
yeah.
overkill. Yes. No, but with regards to SharePoint backups versus SQL backups, Wayne?
Well, what we've done is that we're running all on VMs. So instead of doing an individual SharePoint backup or an SQL backup, we just back up the VM.
But that doesn't cater for your potential restore scenario of, oh, I lost this document and it's not in the recycle bin.
That's where you have to go back to the recycle bin area.
Hmm.
But if you're doing it on a daily basis, you're going to have those backups unless it's during that day
a lot of people say that you know, a restore scenario is enabling version history on all document libraries as well. So it's one of those things that there's actually too many options to cover. Anyone has any sort of specific thing about? I'm trying to give away that prize. Help me out, right? But so it has to be related to SharePoint, though. It can't relate to SQL.
Did you hear those words?
Someone else? I actually
think he deserves
agree.
the prize.
I actually agree.
Use DPM and backup all the VHD in SharePoint environment as a single file.
So
Yeah,
using DPM for excellent, yeah.
I think you should back up the whole VM because you're backing up never to restore.
Yeah.
It's case in every.
Yeah.
Just back up everything.
You can. We're trying to create, I guess, a simple restore scenario.
I'm thinking like using your backup, like to restore, to refresh your test environment without your backup. So is that possible? Like, is there anything like your test environment is different, right?
SharePoint Backup will cater for that need. You don't actually have to create, and that's what we were saying about the snapshots. You don't actually have to create a new SharePoint site with all the content to extract the information. You can actually attach a database snapshot and just extract content from it without, I guess, deploying a whole site.
Shame. I think we better be mindful of time.
All right, we're mindful of time. We're 6 minutes over.
So if anybody, I mean, we will be around for Q&A, but do you
I'll
want to do
let
the prize?
my colleague Shashank decide who the prize for the SharePoint conference in Melbourne free tickets. And there's also a discount, as you may have seen in the previous slide.
Whoever runs up here fastest. No, I'm just kidding.
Excellent.
What?
Thank you very much, guys.
I'll ask a SQL-based question here. What does MaxDop stand for, if you're listening? Oh, okay. Here you go. He set it up first. Congratulations. So what we need your name.